These days, we are all hearing repeated so often that we are in a heightened state of alert. Of course, the media connotation denotes that of fear and fragility, terrorism and trauma. But is this what we really need to be alert to? And is there another underlying cause for all the tumult and evil in this world? Paul Levy, an author, gifted artist, philosopher, teacher, and self-described wounded healer, is one who has tackled this very complex question. And the answer he gives may just surprise you. In this very important dialogue about the dynamics of what he calls a collective psychosis that is plaguing humanity, Paul feels that when we acknowledge that we all play some part in this drama or dream, we will begin the process of healing this virus of the mind. This interview may be challenging for some of you to hear, and for others, it may just be the antidote that you've long been searching for. As always, only you can decide. So take a listen now to my interview with Paul Levy. Paul, you've hit a nerve with many of us who've come into contact with your great work, including me. It was one of your articles that I recently stumbled upon that caught my attention immediately. The article, by the way, was reposted on the ConsciousLifeNews.com website, of which I'm affiliated, and the title that was used in this case was simply Collective Psychosis, the Greatest Sickness Epidemic of Humanity. Now, that headline caught my attention immediately, as well as many other readers. Something about it just sounded familiar to me. So I then went to the website where the article was originally posted, I think about 5 years ago, on realitysandwich.com. And I read the entire two-part article. And, at that point, I had to contact you to have you on the show. Let me say, Paul, you have shed light on this issue of what has been called collective psychosis like no one I've ever heard. So if you would, tell us what got you on this path of discovery, what you've called also malignant egophrenia, or as one indigenous culture has termed it, Wetiko.
Sure. Well, how I came to it was based on my own personal experience, in that it wound up that my father was a really sick guy. And but he wasn't diagnosed, and all that, and I was the only child who was also very sensitive, and I was the recipient of him acting out his abuse, and it basically just in essence it created enormous suffering for me. So this was when I was in my early 20s, as I was individuating and separating from the family, and so it really put me at a crossroads where I could have just become this really dysfunctional person, or I could have, inquired into my experience, my internal experience, and going inside of my own mind, and that's what I chose to do. And that's the entire course of my life, so to speak, became changed from that point on. And then at a certain point, what I realized was that, wow, there's some sort of this illness whose origin is in the psyche that was explicating itself through the field, through the entire this non-local field that was operating in my family and in the field surrounding us. And then I recognized, that's the exact same illness that's operating in the greater body politic of the world. So that the actual, my personal this example that I was living was getting reflected through the macrocosm, and that really opened me up to a whole, to a deeper investigation.
That's quite a story, Paul, that you've told, and I've heard you actually tell that story before, and of course, very courageous of you to share something so intimate and personal, and yet so important, I think, because when you share how tribulation has been used to learn how tumult can be a teacher, and perhaps that's indicative of what we're going to get into about Wetiko. So again, I applaud you for that. So let's get into, because people may be saying, well, what on earth is she talking about, Wetiko? Why don't you give us a little thumbnail of what that's all about, where that came from?
Sure. So it's this Native American term that connotes the spirit of evil, and so all that I'm doing, I'm just a translator. And it's not just the Native Americans. I mean, every tradition that's based in spiritual wisdom or understanding has its own symbol system for pointing out Wetiko, and calls it by different names. And the idea is that the origin is in the psyche. It's not something objective or external to us, and it operates through the psyche as well as having the origin in the psyche, and it operates through the unconscious, through the parts of us that have blind spots, in such a way that we then unwittingly become the instrument to act it out in the world, and at the same time it hides itself from being seen, so we're not aware that we unwittingly become its instrument. And so it's actually this you could think of it as sort of the psychological form of being blind, like this blindness of the mind, in which people who are afflicted with it actually believe that they're seeing clearly. And not only that, but they believe that they're seeing more clearly than people who are actually clear-sighted. And one other way of describing it is that it operates through the part of us that projects. We're always projecting onto the inkblot of the waking dream, so to speak, but it operates through the projective tendencies of the mind in such a way that we then think that our projections actually exist outside of ourselves, and then we react to our projections, becoming conditioned by our own energy, and we become entranced through that whole process. So what it does, it actually taps into the part of us that actually is a co-creator of our experience in such a way that it turns that gift in ourselves to be these geniuses of creating our reality. In a way, it turns it against us in a way that we become imprisoned by our own genius. So that's a real thumbnail sketch of Wetiko. And of course, I could say like a lot more. I've written a whole book about it. But that's just the simplest introduction.
I think that was a great summation of what it is, and as always, very articulate. There's a lot there, a lot of dimensions to what you just said in such a short period of time. But I'm going to quote you on something. You've said that Wetiko is a, quote, a misidentification of who we imagine who we are. So the key, I would say, Paul, here is imagine. The role that imagination, creativity play. So if you could elaborate on that a little bit, that philosophy, that would be great.
Well, it's all based on not just the idea, but the actual fact that the creative imagination is fundamental to our experience, to how we experience, the outside world and how we experience ourselves. And so what Wetiko does, and the way to think about Wetiko, it's sort of like this, almost like when you get like some sort of bug and you have like, you get like some sort of like whether it's a virus, it's like a virus of the mind. And it plugs into our imagination, to our creativity in such a way that, like I was saying, it turns it against ourselves. And what it does, it's a shape-shifting sort of entity that will shapeshift, and it'll assume our form. It'll imitate us. It'll put us on in such a way, which putting us on has a double meaning, like putting us on like a suit of clothes, but also putting us on means that, we get fooled. And if we then identify with its image of who we are, so it'll ape us. It'll be like this mime. It'll mimic us and imitate us and impersonate us. And if we then identify with its version of ourselves, we've then, in a sense, disconnected from our own intrinsic, from our true self, and we've given it away to this seemingly other entity that actually doesn't even exist. And so that's kind of like that whole process I really go into, but it works through the imaginative faculty of us, of our minds. When
do you suppose, assuming, everything has a beginning and maybe not, or an ending, maybe not, when do you think, if there was a period of time that Wetiko embedded itself in the collective unconscious of humankind,
And that's a discussion I actually go into in the book, where I talk about there are all these theories, like some people talk about, clearly, in different sort of like these mythologies, they'll talk about there's a fall of mankind, or whether some sort of external force, did an intervention, to really whatever in this negative way with reference to our evolution. But the point I make is that the thing about Wetiko is that it's getting created in this moment where we are co-creating it, all of us, not just you and me, but 7 billion of us humans. It's a phenomena. It's a phenomena that we're all co-creating or not every moment. And so that, I think, is the essential thing, that it's something that's available to us that we're actually participating in the co-creation of right now.
Mm-hmm. I think that's, yeah, I can understand that. Well, I want to get into Jung, of course, because you are a fantastic student, and I would say a scholar of Jung. But here's something that came to me as, again, I was reading some of your great work. Another point from an article that I read that caught my attention is it talks about this self-creation dynamic. You say, and this is an article, by the way, people, that has not come out for publication yet. Little teaser here, but I want to base a lot of what we're going to be talking about on this article. It's brilliant. But I'm going to quote from it. You say, "It is as if we have become possessed by a self-created Frankenstein monster that is running amok." Now, I want to bring something up to you and see if you have any understanding of this term. It reminds me of another, Paul, a very strange and yet very well documented phenomenon called the Tulpa. Are you familiar with that?
Yeah, totally.
Okay, all right. And for those that don't know, a tulpa is, I would call it a literal throw-off of one's own consciousness that has the ability to become manifest as a separate and yet a connected entity. And by the way, the tulpa I became familiar with by way of our mutual colleague, Neil Kramer, who's talked about it in his own work. But it is a dynamic that is well known in some circles of old Tibetan Buddhism. So what are the correlations there? I found that also very intriguing.
Yeah, well, what it makes me think of is so on the one hand, indigenous people would talk about, there are these negative entities like a demon or something like that, where in psychology they would talk about what they refer to as demons would be the phrase an autonomous complex. It's a part of the wholeness of our psyche that whether it's based on some form of trauma or whatever, we split off, that wholeness splits off, and it'll develop over the course of time some form of seemingly autonomous other quality where it'll appear as if, or will experience as if it's something other than ourselves. And the autonomy will be so complete at a certain point, it'll appear as if it has an actual intention that's other than our own intention. It'll appear as if it'll have a mind or a life of its own that's separate from ourselves. And that's an expression of the extent of how split off we are from that aspect of ourselves. And what I'm describing as being an autonomous complex, that's analogous to the Tulpa idea in Tibetan Buddhism, and that's also what indigenous people call a demon. But the point that I'm making is that, on certain levels, of course, you have to honor them as some other, they because they manifest from our subjective experience as being other. We have to honor that, and that's how we need to have some form of being able to relate to them as some form of other. But ultimately, the ultimate point of view is that they're not separate from our own nature. And it's when you see that's when you can really begin to integrate them into the wholeness of who we are.
Right. Well, you know what that reminds me of immediately? One of my favorites, a philosopher and late physicist, David Bohm, and his description of autonomous subtotals. We are autonomous subtotals.
I quote exactly that phrase in a physics book. Yeah, David Bohm is amazing. Yeah, he was just really switched on to this. Absolutely. And the point is, we become entranced because they will manifest as so convincingly as seemingly other. It's just like when you're in a dream and there's a demon in the dream and you don't know you're dreaming, you're going to be running away or scared or reacting to that energy. But in the ultimate sense, what is that dream? In the ultimate sense, it's nothing other than your own energy just projected out as the dream. And to have that realization, that's to have lucidity, that's to wake up to the dreamlike nature. And I'm basically pointing out in my work that same situation is available to us in the waking dream, that what we're thinking as being outside of ourselves, in the form of the whole objective world, this seemingly objective world, that similar to a dream where you can have lucidity and recognize oh, it's actually a reflection of my internal, what's going on inside of me. The same thing in our waking dream. We can have that exact same understanding.
Mm-hmm. Beautiful. Well, I just want to make sure for the audience that you are all sort of understanding. This is a very complex and a very important discussion, I think, that we're having. I couldn't wait to have you on because I think it's so needed right now. But I want to make sure our audience understands what we're talking about, what this is, how pervasive it is, and what responsibility we all take. So we're going to dig into that. So basically, just in sum, we're talking about what has been called a virus of the mind, a sickness of the mind,
Right.
that is somewhat embedded in the collective psyche, that we all play a part in. It has a shadow aspect. It is, I suppose if you're looking at all of reality as we see it or participate in it as a dream. These are very esoteric concepts, but fortunately we have an audience, I think, that's really tuned into that. But it is complex, so I want to make sure that people understand exactly what you're laying out in your thesis, because, again, there's some points that
Sure.
that I think need to be elaborated on. So,
Could I just clarify one thing?
Please, yes.
Yeah. So the really the underlying point of view that I'm coming from, and I began having these experiences, like 30 years ago or something, was that we're having a collective shared dream right now, that we're all, we're the dreamers of the dream, and we're collaboratively dreaming up this world together. And what that means is that what's happening in the seemingly outer world is actually a reflection of what's happening inside of us. And the thing about the Wetiko virus is that it's a collective psychosis. Mm-hmm. So that's important, because what I'm pointing at is that there's a collective psychosis that's endemic, that's running rampant in the greater body politic of the world. But we've become so kind of, we're under almost like an anesthesia, like we've become like sort of numb to the incredible insanity that we're playing out, that we're destroying the biosphere, which is the support system, the life support system of our species. We're actively destroying it. And so in that new article that you made reference to that's not quite out yet, I point out that, if like an enlightened alien came and looked sort of objectively from outside the system of what we were doing, they would be scratching their head going, why is the most intelligent species that's ever emerged on planet Earth, why are they actively committing collective suicide? And so the thing I'm saying is that process, as it's playing out in the world, is actually reflecting a deep unconscious inner process that's happening within our psyche, and it behooves us to recognize that.
Mm-hmm. I think you're right. Well, I was just going to say, again, we're talking about a great deal of people, particularly in the alternative community, who are starting to dig in, kick the tires, look under the hood of what's really going on in terms of what we call conspiracy. Yes, I said the word. And they may be saying, wait a minute, I'm not the one with the psychosis here. It's these evildoers, So I'm going to say this. So to them, it may seem that Wetiko has an instigator that lives outside of the borders of humanity, that this psychosis is happening to us rather than by us, by those who wish harm on humanity. So again, I think it's important for people to understand that it can project itself. I'm not, by all means, condoning those that do wish harm on humanity, because I believe that there are. But at the same time, it can, even those characters may be used as sort of archetypes to reflect back to us something that's coming from within us in order to shift it. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, that totally. And like what that brings up for me, the thing about Wetiko that makes it so one of a kind, it's an inner disease of the soul that actually expresses itself. It somehow is able to collapse the boundary between the inner and the outer. So it's an inner disease of the soul that is able to configure events in the outside world so as to express itself through the medium of the outside world in a synchronistic fashion. And it's when any of us begins to have the recognition of that correlation between the outer and the inner, oh, what's happening in the outer world is symbolizing something that's happening in me, and that's just like a dream, because when you think about a dream, what is a dream? The outer forms of the dream are actually an expression of the psyche of the dreamer. They're not separate. And so the thing I'm saying is that, one of the major ways of seeing Wetiko is to see what I call the dreamlike nature of reality.
Mm-hmm. Okay, I think
and that, by the way, is the major insight of quantum physics.
Mm-hmm.
That's why I just wrote this whole book about that when you really distill what is the essence of what this, we all know, quantum physics is supposedly this amazing thing. Well, what is it that it's actually tapping into? And they'll talk about, they'll say, oh yeah, we've proven empirically beyond a shadow of doubt that there's no such thing as an objective, this world outside of us. It makes no sense to even talk about something objective outside of us, that the act of observing the universe actually evokes the universe observed, that the observer is the observed. That's a description of the dream.
Mm-hmm. It's very quantum in its implications. And speaking of which, I want to talk about someone who you are, I say a student of, but I would also say you are a student of, but I would also say a scholar of, and that's the great psychologist and mystic, I think we all know he was, Carl Gustav Jung.
Mm-hmm.
So I want to after I read your piece, Paul, I went into my collection of Jungian books, and one of them, the first thing that came to mind is On the Nature of the Psyche, that essay that he wrote that is so phenomenal and has so many hallmarks of the thesis that you're putting forward. He talks about what he called a sort of seeming paradox, saying that the psyche is both conscious and unconscious at the same time. He says, quote, "The psyche is a conscious / unconscious whole." And this, of course, has a holographic as well as quantum implications, that being sort of likened to the wave particle duality structure of reality, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, totally. And the thing about the psyche, it's a totality that includes both the conscious and the unconscious. Mm-hmm. And the point is to have that the boundary between the two be really fluid and permeable, so that contents can pass back and forth between the two, as compared to people who are really more identified with their conscious ego, and then they're split off from the unconscious, which then acts itself out through them in the form of whether they just act out their unconscious, unhealed behavior, or just in different symptoms. So the idea is to develop some form of some kind of, relationship or dialogue between those two, definitely.
Okay.
And the thing I'm saying is that when I talk about that the way to see Wetiko is to see, this being some form of dreamlike nature, this world we live in, is that, well, what is the language of dreams? And it speaks in symbols,
right?
And so the thing, and the thing with Jung, he spent this whole career fighting to try to bring back symbolic awareness. And what he was meaning was to see that this universe is an oracle, and it's speaking in the language of symbols. Mm-hmm. And that when we see that, and the same thing, just think about your night dream. You have a night dream, you wake up, you ask yourself, oh, how would I interpret that? What does it mean? What symbols are in it? What parts of myself are appearing? Well, the same perspective, we can interpret our experience in our life in that same way. And the thing which is interesting is that the more we establish ourselves in that viewpoint of seeing symbolically, the more the universe will then manifest symbolically, because it's not out there. It's a reflection of our own mind.
That's where we really get into this synchronicity and the implications of that, which the audience knows. I'm a huge fan of synchronicity, which is based, predicated on symbolism, on symbology. The subjective, though, I think. Don't you? I think that a lot of the symbols that we choose to interpret are designed exquisitely for the individual.
Yeah, well, the thing is that, and I talk about this in my book, that symbols don't exist objectively, separate from the mind that's observing them. Mm-hmm. So it's kind of like there's this cooperation between the psyche, and then the symbol will come seemingly outside of ourselves, be it in a night dream or the waking dream, but that symbol is tailor-suited to exactly where we're at in our psyche. And then as soon as we take in that symbol and understand it to whatever degree we do, then the symbol changes to reflect our new understanding. So it's a continual sort of going, this back and forth between the psyche and the symbols that emerge out of it. And the whole idea, and I talk about this, is that the whole point of that is to help us to wake up.
Mm-hmm. Well, I'm thinking about that, the symbolic, well, I say symbology or symbols as a language, and how people, Paul, I think are starting to become more sensitive to symbols like numbers. You know what just popped into my mind? 1111. I have been trying my level best to get to the bottom of it. I don't know that there is a bottom. I think the rabbit hole gets it's infinitely deep. But the fact that this what would you call it? Burgeoning. It's more than a trend. More and more people are seeing 11 or variations of. And there is obviously something quite synchronistic and important going on. Let's talk about that. Let's veer off for a minute. What are your thoughts? You know what I'm talking about, right? With this
totally.
phenomenon.
Yeah.
How would that play into this thesis that we're putting together here, if at all?
Yeah, well, what I would say is like, okay, an example. Say if if there's something that I want to bring tomorrow to the cafe and that's home and I don't want to forget to bring it. Well, I might put like something, I might put an object in front of my front door, so when I leave tomorrow morning, I'll see the object, and oh yeah, I need to bring that thing. It'll help to remind me. Mm-hmm. So if you just look at that, it's like, in this moment, I'm actually planting something in the fabric of the waking dream for a future self to find, and once I find it in that future, it's going to remind me of something that I need to remember. Well, what you're talking about is that what about if there's this deeper part of us that's the dreamer of the dream, and it plants into the fabric of our life these clues during the course of our life to help us to remember, to help us to wake up. And the idea that whether so many people they look at the clock and it's 11:11, I mean, that definitely happens to me a lot. That could be one of these signals or these clues or these, a stimulator for our lucidity that the deeper part of us have planted in the waking dream, and we're, when we're fated at exactly the right moment to come across those particular clues or these signals to help us to remember something. So that's kind of what it brings up for me.
Sure, me too. But then the billion-dollar question is, what is the significance of that number and what it's trying to get us to remember? And I'm not necessarily asking you to answer unless you have some thoughts on it. I have no idea. I don't know. I mean, that's, just like any symbol, it's subjective. But the thing, if I can just say something about symbols that's really interesting, because going back to Wetiko, the thing about Wetiko, it inspires the deepest evil that our species is capable of. So in a way, it has this diabolic energy to it. And etymologically, diabolic means that which separates and creates division. Now, the antonym for diabolic is symbolic, and symbolic is that which brings together. So it's interesting. You have like two things that are typically conceived of as being opposites. Like a perfect example is Christ. Christ, on the one hand, he's the Son of God, right? So he's supposedly an embodiment of God, and yet he's a human being. So he's things which are normally conceived of as being totally opposite, co-joined into a symbol. And Christ himself, in the apocryphal text, is actually instructing his disciples to see him that way, to see him symbolically. And so I just find it interesting that the actual antidote to the diabolic is the symbolic, and symbols are the language of dreams. And what that's pointing at is that the way really for us to get a handle on our world crisis is to begin to see the nature of our situation, which is this is some form of collective dream that we're having. And that's not any sort of theory. Like the Buddha was saying himself, please don't take my word for it. Do the inquiry yourself. See if what I'm saying is true. And that's all. I'm saying the same thing. I'm just saying, hey, look, there are ways we can inquire into the present moment nature of our experience that will actually show us the dreamlike nature. Mm-hmm. And I agree with you, but here's the conundrum, Paul, and that is, and this perhaps is indicative of the diabolical nature of this that we call Wetiko, and that is this also what seems to be this collective complacency. And, this isn't, you're making an ask here. We're all making that ask of each other. Look into it. But the people seem to be so, for a lot of reasons, and some of them are justifiable, stressed out, dealing with everyday reality, that they wouldn't even think to look into it, or don't have the time to look into it. And still others don't even know this dynamic exists. They've never tuned in or intuited it to know that it can be explored. That
right.
in and of itself, to me, is a hallmark, in a way, of Wetiko.
Yeah. That's exactly it. That's the extent of the collective psychosis, that so many people just don't have time or energy, or don't even have a clue that there's anything out of ordinary that's going on. But what that makes me think of is that for the people, maybe like the two of us and other people who are tuning into it and who are tapping into it, that there's a responsibility that we have to find our creative voice, because it goes back to what you were saying about being creative, that one of the antidotes for Wetiko is creativity, because it actually plugs into our own creativity in such a way, because it has no creativity of its own. But then it can piggyback on our creativity and plug into our creativity in a way where then it will turn us, we'll then express our creativity to serve it. So the point is that when any of us really tap into our own creativity, which etymologically has to do with finding one's voice and genius and calling and vocation, all of those words have to do with creativity. And also etymologically it has to do with the word daimon.
I'm so glad you brought that up. Yes.
And daimon is the guiding spirit, is the inner voice. And the point is that if so many people, we all have a daimon, an inner voice, but most of us, we just ignore it, or we have all these excuses why we can't follow it or listen to it, and then that daimon constellates negatively and becomes a demon. But if we honor that daimon, then we find the calling, the genius, the inner guide, the guiding spirit, the vocation, all of those things come along with it, and all that's needed is for us to actually develop relationship with the daimon, and that then will help us access our creative spirit, which will heal us. And as more and more of us do that, we actually can be healing agents for the planet.
I want to piggyback on that. I'm so glad you brought up the daimon aspect, because I've heard you speak about this, and you've actually said that in this mode of being the guiding spirit, the daimon, we can dream a whole new dream. But I want to bring up something. Let's see if you resonate with this, Paul. This is my mind just sort of going out on a out into the cosmos.
Sure.
I was thinking about this whole idea of daimon, and it's spelled D-A-E-M-O-N. And here's what occurred to me. When you take the A out of daimon, you have, as you mentioned, demon. Now, in a metaphorical way to me, extracting the A out of daimon is to extract the alpha. And when you look at the various meanings of alpha, I looked it up, just specifically what it said. Alpha is defined as the first, the beginning, but it's also in astronomy referred to designate the brightest star in a constellation, ergo the guiding spirit. So when you take that alpha out, that A out of daimon, that's when trouble starts. The brightest star in the constellation goes out. Does that make sense to you?
Yeah, no, totally. That totally does. And yeah, and it's funny because just, what that brings up for me is, and I talk about this, in my book, is that the thing about sort of like when you think about Wetiko, it can't steal our soul, but it can trick us into giving it away. So in a sense, we're in possession of this treasure that's hard to attain, or the Holy Grail, like the highest value. There are all these different phrases for it. But what Wetiko does, it somehow inspires us to forget it, to have this amnesia, and then to sort of project our own genius outside of ourselves. And it's very much having to do with what you're saying. When we take out that alpha from the daimon, then what we're left with is this negative spirit. which we then unwittingly, you see, the thing about that is then we unwittingly become taken over by it and become an instrument so that it can act itself out through us. And all the while, we have no idea that that's happening. We can easily feel, gee, I've never felt, I feel so in touch with myself. And yet, that's the way it works when we become possessed by an archetypal energy, that we don't know we're possessed by it.
Mm-hmm. Well, I know you've talked about many times, this is something I definitely want us to elaborate on a little bit, is let's say people listening right now are understanding that the fundamentals of how we're describing Wetiko is this virus of the psyche, and yet they're seeing it in other people, but not necessarily taking the responsibility of owning it themselves. It reminds me of a Shakespearean phrase that comes from the play Julius Caesar that I find so apropos in this regard. And it's one that Dan Rather used when he was recently on my show, and he used it. And it says, "The fault, dear Brutus, is not in our stars, but in ourselves. We, you, me, others are keeping Wetiko alive." Talk about that, if you would, how an understanding the true nature of Wetiko and getting on the road to healing that one must admit they too have it.
Right. I so appreciate you bringing that up, because the thing about Wetiko, it feeds off of fear and otherness. So if we think, for example, that they out there, whoever the they is, have Wetiko and we don't, we've then fallen under its thrall, because we're then feeding the polarization that's in the field. The idea being that Wetiko, it's an illness that it's in the collective unconscious, and that means we all have it in potential at any moment. And so then if we see somebody out there having it, we might be seeing something, and guess what? If this is a dream, they're our dream character. We're looking in a mirror and they're reflecting. If they're possessed by Wetiko at that moment and acting something out that's really hurtful and evil, well, guess what? Being a dream character, they're reflecting that part of ourselves. And so then when you begin to see that, it actually cultivates like this compassion, And so I just, that whole idea that if we otherize anybody else and project our own shadow outside of ourselves, then we're actually unwittingly an agent for Wetiko.
Brilliant. I've heard you say that, and that again struck a chord with me. I'll tell you a little story about how, although I wasn't referring to it as Wetiko at the time, we could call it ego, I suppose, or some very demonic aspect of it. And we all have it. We've got to admit we all have it. And I'm very sensitive about that. And I'll make this very brief, but I remember when I started to truly understand how pervasive, and again, I'm looking at it as ego, how pervasive ego is in today's society, and probably has been since the dawn of mankind. I recall, Paul, being at an event, a friend's gathering with a lot of people, and one of our close friends had come to the event and made this massive announcement about this big opportunity that he just got. And this particular person, can tend to be a little outspoken and likes a lot of attention, and immediately I got enraged by it. I'd get inside saying, okay, this person's doing what they typically do. And meanwhile, the same day or day after, we had some big news that we were about to announce, and I felt like the person was overshadowing me, and so I chimed in and said, well, we've got blah, blah, blah going on. And, I went home and I said, what did I just do? What did I just do? Now, here I am accusing this person of being an egomaniac, and I'm doing the same thing. Do you know that was my epiphany? That I've got work to do here. Why did I do that? I felt horrible. And although I was somewhat diplomatic, at the time, I knew where it was coming from. I knew it was coming from a shadow aspect of myself. And it was at that point that I resolved to explore this. So I like to think of that perhaps as the road to, and I don't consider myself an overly egotistic person, but we all have a tinge of it. Some people more than others, right? What?
Totally. And the thing, you see, I so appreciate that example, because the Wetiko virus, it's this non-local energy, so it's not bound in third-dimensional space and time. And what that means, as an example, is that if it all of a sudden, if it manifests through somebody else, like say through that person who's making that announcement, the non-local aspect, we then will react. We'll get triggered in our mind. And then if we don't metabolize what's triggered in ourselves, but if we then just in that moment just act it out, it's like it's become contagious. We then become a vector for the propagation of the disease in our unconscious reactivity. You see? So, and that's where the thing about Wetiko being a collective psychosis, yeah, it can take over one particular person and they could act it out in their life, but for it to really to replicate itself through the field, it needs masses of people. You know, and so it feeds, keeping in mind, it feeds off the unconscious and into the unconscious through the blind spots. And so just think about that example. Like, here's this person making an announcement, and maybe he's coming from, this egoic place. So then it triggers in other people their egoic reactions. And then all of a sudden, the whole field, there's like this psychic epidemic throughout the field. And that's Wetiko. It's a collective psychosis.
Very, very. That is clear. That is absolutely clear. Well, speaking of collective, we've got to talk about the collective psychosis, where we stand today. We're recording this on July 25th, 2016. There is just so much going on, Paul, in terms of the escalation of what we'll call Wetiko. What's happening here? Are we on the precipice of just a complete paradigm shift? Is there a gift in this insanity? Because it certainly is insane right now.
Right. No, and that's a great question too, because the way I think about it that I hope can be helpful is when you have a dream and there's something unconscious, something in our shadows that are being shown to us in the dream, well, if we don't understand the message, well, guess what? That dream is going to recur, and that shadow element is even going to be more amplified. And then, ad infinitum, it will just become a recurring dream until we finally get the message. And getting the message is to see, oh yeah, it's reflecting something inside of me that I need to understand or expand my consciousness. And so it's very much like that. But the thing about Wetiko, you see, that's so amazing. Here it is, the deepest, darkest, it's like the most evil energy that our species is possibly capable of, that Wetiko informs that and inspires that, and superposed in that same entity of Wetiko is an incredible, this blessing and this gift. Mm-hmm. And not only does it contain its own medicine, but it actually has a gift for us in that Wetiko can actually help us, it can show us the dreamlike nature of reality, which is to say it can help us to remember who we are and to wake up, which we wouldn't have done without Wetiko's manifestation. So that's really interesting, because that brings up a whole question. Oh, well, is Wetiko this deepest, darkest evil, or is it the highest good? Well, it seems to be in alchemy, they talk about the coincidence of opposites, and it actually contains both the deepest, darkest evil and the highest sublime sacred divinity superposed in one particular energy, and how it manifests. Same thing within quantum physics. How does light manifest? Well, as a wave or a particle. It depends how we observe it. The same thing with Wetiko. Will it manifest in this evil, destructive way, or in this incredibly, this liberating way? It depends how we dream it.
Right. The focus that we choose to take, the purview.
Yeah.
Wow, that is so powerful. That is really powerful. And you and I were talking offline just before we started the show, and I had, again, been familiar with your sort of thesis on this part of it, and I thought, well, gee, that's so homeopathic in a way, that it is the cure is within the virus in a way.
Yeah, totally. And that,
right?
And I said to you that's a metaphor that I use in my book. The idea being that, we have to, just like with homeopathy, you take in a little bit of the poison to stimulate the immune response. In the same thing, we have to contemplate Wetiko, and we have to shed light on the darkness and see how it operates both out in the world and in our complicity, how
right.
It operates within our own psyches. And by taking in that darkness in ourselves homeopathically, that then will activate, that will act, like I was saying, whether it's the immune response or this deeper medicine, this gift that's encoded in the virus, will then start to reveal itself. But it'll only do that if we recognize what it's showing us.
Right. Well, you say taking it in, but I think in this case, really just acknowledging that it's already within, but openly, consciously accepting that and taking it in.
Yeah, and taking responsibility for our own darkness. Because the thing is, when we don't take responsibility for our own darkness and we project out the shadow, then being like a dream, then we're going to find all the evidence. People are then going to be carrying our projection, our shadow projection, and they're going to be embodying the projection and acting that in front of our eyes, and then we have all the evidence we need. Oh, well, the evil really is out there, which entrenches us even further in the viewpoint of projecting the shadow even more, and it becomes an infinitely self-perpetuating feedback loop. And but if you see that process and you see, wait a second, that darkness, that evil that I'm seeing outside of myself, it's actually a reflection of my own darkness, of how I'm complicit in evil. Then all of a sudden you like take back your shadow projection and you take responsibility for your own darkness, and then you're not offering yourself as food for the Wetiko virus.
Taking responsibility. And again, this whole discussion and this whole idea, Paul, is it's, to me, perennial philosophy.
Oh, totally.
We've heard, other variations of the same sort of construct before, that, the people that annoy us the most are really mirrors of some unconscious aspect that we're trying to heal. I remember reading that many, many years ago. And I think there are a lot of people that are aware of some semblance of that message, and yet there's so many. And I look at people today, not all, but far too many, who are unwilling to take responsibility. First of all, unwilling to even see that they have that aspect in themselves, being so anxious to place blame outside of themselves. That's something I think that's been cultivated, and continuing to spread the virus unwittingly. I do a segment called Conscious Commentary twice a month, where I just kind of weigh in on some of these more philosophical issues. And the thing I just did was on forgiveness, the frequency, not just the feeling of it, but the frequency of forgiveness and all of those things that can solve some of these things, or acceptance, responsibility. Still, there's so many people that are just not tuned in that way. What do we do?
Oh, well, no, I know. Well, what do we do? I mean, you see, that's really interesting, because, it makes me think of, there are some really, well-intentioned, these people who are interested in real and being spiritual, and then I'll come in and I'll mention the idea of, evil and Wetiko, and they just run out the door screaming. They just, oh, no, we don't want to look at that, we don't want to think about that, we just want to affirm the light. And it's really interesting, because in them doing that, by them having an avoidance of dealing with the darkness, they're unwittingly giving the darkness power over them. Yeah. And the thing I point out is that if you become too fascinated by the darkness, then you're feeding it too. But the idea of actually seeing how it works, like seeing the covert psychological operations of evil through our minds and through how it operates in the field, in the world. And then when you see that, then as a sovereign being, you have a choice of, I see you, and now I'm choosing that I don't want to invest my attention in you anymore, in the darkness. I now want to invest my attention in creating the world I want to live in. That's what's available to us. And particularly when you connect with other people who are also beginning to wake up to that level of realization, what you discover is that you can actually put it's what I call the sacred power of dreaming. You can put our sacred power of dreaming together to change the dream. And that's evolutionary, and that's what this is all about. And, of course, I go into that a whole lot in my book, but that's sort of the gift. That's what's being offered to us through the Wetiko epidemic.
By the way, audience, this book that he's speaking of, I'm holding in my hot little hands right now. It is called Dispelling Wetiko, Breaking the Curse of Evil. And this is a pretty meaty book, very comprehensive. We're talking, I can't see too well, 500, no, much more. About 400 pages. There's a lot of good reading material here, and this is not your only book. We're going to have you plug that a little bit more later. But yes, what I was going to ask you is you're talking to these people who previously, or still maybe, don't want to look at anything less than light. They don't want to look at the shadow. After you explain so cogently what this is all about, what's their response after that? Do they sort of change their tune and decide to look from this perspective, or do they not?
No, some people do, but a lot of people don't, because they're so, it actually, built in, I guess one way to think about it, there's a counter incentive to have this realization, to see our own complicity, because it induces a form of trauma. Because, we then, if we have people out there to blame and the evil is out there, and we then unconsciously identify with, I'm just good and innocent and all that, very comfortable identity, and to all of a sudden see through that and to realize that the world is not the way we've been imagining and that we're actually complicit, in the evil, and that we have to take responsibility for our unconscious, darker impulses, that can shake us up. That's really shattering, and that can be a form of PTSD. So people have to have the courage. It's sort of like when you're involved in a cult, you have to have the courage to see through how you've deceived yourself. And so there are some people who just aren't able to do that. And then to answer your question that you asked me before, I think the best way for any of us to be with them is just to embody that realization without trying to convince anybody of anything or change their viewpoint. But just for us to really embody it and to be in our heart and to really, as much as we're able to be in touch with our true nature as compassion, because compassion is an expression of our true nature, I think that energetically really can have an effect.
Agreed. And I also am a huge fan of resonate, I should say, with the butterfly effect, because that is brilliant in showing how we do have an effect non-locally all the time. Again, in asking that question, I try to answer it for myself by not ranting about certain ideologies that may or may not jive with another person. I had to learn that, by the way. That took some time, because you feel so passionate about something. You want something that you can see so clearly and others can't. It can be frustrating, but I learned to back off of that and simply, as you said, embody to the best of my ability the very thing that I would like to see change in another, and know and trust that in this thing that we call the butterfly effect, it is having an effect, maybe halfway around the world. So,
totally. And if I could, just one image, a beautiful image that comes up. If you have like crystal of like sugar and you just dissolve it in a glass of water, each crystal will just dissolve and dissolve until you reach the saturation point, and then you add one more crystal of sugar, and a crystal will just manifest in the solution. And, so any of us self-reflecting or owning our shadow or having the recognition of the dreamlike nature might be that grain of sugar that crystallizes a global awakening in our whole species. And then that's a true possibility. So that can be really inspiring for each of us, because you see, one of the dangers, and this is a Wetiko ploy, is to get involved in feeling pessimistic. And then if we get identified with the pessimistic viewpoint, we're then going to draw all the evidence, being like a dream, to support us in our viewpoint, which then entrenches us even more in that viewpoint in a feedback loop. But the point is that, the opposite of that is that if we have that feeling, wow, any of us, self-reflecting in this moment, like you were saying, in a non-local way, could affect and not only could, but it is affecting, it's getting deposited into the collective unconscious in that moment.
Beautifully said. And as you're describing all this, I'm looking at this gift-curse duality, this wave-particle duality that is existing, omnipresent all the time, that Wetiko is clearly self-perpetuating. It's the recurring dream. However, the moment you realize that A, it's a dream, and B, that you can change the course of the dream, it shifts. I want to read a quote. As we're winding down, I want to read a quote that you may be familiar with that always struck me as having significance in this regard. Have you ever seen the movie Jacob's Ladder?
Yeah, I did like a whole number of years ago.
It's a pretty old movie. I think maybe even in the late 80s, maybe early 90s. But if you remember, is it Tim Robbins that plays the lead character of this traumatized Vietnam vet, and he goes to this chiropractor who's played by Danny Aiello. But I'm not going to do a spoiler alert because I don't want to spoil the premise, but something that Danny Aiello, the chiropractor, says to the character played by Tim Robbins has to do with something similar. It's about the fear of dying, but I think it's also a metaphor for something bigger. He says, the only thing that burns in hell is the part of you that won't let go of life, your memories, your attachments. They burn them all away, but they're not punishing you, he said. They're freeing your soul. He says, if you're frightened of dying and you're holding on, you'll see devils tearing your life away. But if you've made your peace, then the devils are really angels freeing you from the earth. Now, does that make sense in terms of, there's always, that was profound for me. It's how you look at it.
What it brings up for me, and it's what you had brought up something in the earlier part of our talk about, like, Wetiko is this sort of misidentification of who we think we are. And that's really, that is so true, because what it is that we then, to the extent that we fall under the whole like getting conned by Wetiko, we then identify with like thinking that we're this egoic, this point, this sort of like this self-encapsulated ego, which is like an entity, which we then grasp on and cling to, and we defend and protect and try to sustain moment by moment, and all of our energy is getting invested in that process. And the thing which is amazing is that we don't even exist in that way that we're imagining ourselves to. So that's what it brings up, that whole scene from that movie, of that, yeah, if we're still like, if we're not letting go or seeing through, if we're still holding on to that reference point and imagining and identifying that that's who we are, then that actually is, like, in Buddhism, that was the Buddha's realization that that's the cause of our suffering, and that's the actual source of evil in our world. Like, that process, individually and collectively, elaborates itself and it will manifest in all the evil that we're playing out on each other. And that's why in an earlier work I called Wetiko, like you had mentioned, malignant egophrenia, or ME disease, me disease. And it's a misidentification of who we think we are. That's the root of Wetiko.
Yeah. Brilliant, compelling, important people. I urge you to look into this. Look inside. We must at this juncture. I think we can fix a lot of what we're complaining about being out there by going in here. If you want to learn more about Wetiko, everyone, I urge you to go to Paul Levy's website, awakeinthedream.com, where there are...
Can I point out, it's actually, there's an N, it's AWAKEN.
I said, he's going to, I think I'm going to be corrected here. Awaken the Dream.
No.
I'm going to let you say it. You tell us.
Awakeinthedream.com.
Awakeinthedream.com. I stand to be corrected.
Yeah, no worries.
We will have a link that will, the correct link, by the way, link to this post. So I apologize for that. But I've been there, and it's chock full of so many resources, including lots of his great articles. And you can also get a copy of his book, Dispelling Wetiko, Breaking the Curse of Evil. It's a must read. This is an exhaustive volume on this very disturbing and enlightening phenomenon. So I urge you to pick up a copy. Paul Levy, what can I say? Yeah, I'm going to tell you, I have called you publicly, by the way, one of the leading spiritual philosophers of our time. I'm proud to know you.
Wow, well, thank you so much. I really appreciate that. I don't know what to say. Thank you.
Well, thank you. And take care, everyone. Thanks for listening to Higher Journeys Radio. It's time to put the Alpha, the bright star, the guiding spirit back into our lives. In understanding the dynamic of Wetiko, and to own the notion that we all participate in this illness of the mind, is the first integral step in healing it, not just for ourselves individually, but for our planet. Wetiko, as Paul describes it, is the shadow that has the ability to transform into light. But we must be the willing agents, the alchemists who turn lead into gold. If we are all creating this collective dream, then certainly we have the ability to create a new dream and bring our human condition back into the light. Thank you, as always, for tuning in to Higher Journeys Radio. Until next time, I'm your host, Alexis Brooks.